Welcome to Farmers for Climate Action's launch of Foot Off the Gas, how a gas-led recovery will impact Australian farmers. This important briefing paper explores the implications of gas exploration and mining on farming communities and agricultural land, and was produced by the Australian Farm Institute, commissioned by the Australian Conservation Foundation and Farmers for Climate Action. Before I talk more about the paper, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I live on, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that you are all joining us from right now. As you perhaps know, Farmers for Climate Action is a movement of farmers and rural and regional Australians advocating for climate action on farm and effective policy and leadership to slow climate change and lower emissions. I think we'd all agree that we're living in an extraordinary time currently. With developments internationally and closer to home recently, I feel we can have really serious cause for optimism regarding climate action. The impetus for change has perhaps never been greater. It is essential, however, that the full implications of any change to be made are considered well. That's why when the federal government announced plans for a gas-led recovery, we looked to the AFI to explore what this means for Australian farming. We've undoubtedly had some milestone outcomes this year, including the National Farmers Federation endorsing an economy-wide net zero target for 2050 in their climate policy. And at the state government level, we've seen significant policy progress regarding renewable roadmaps, renewable energy zones, and commitments to net zero 2030. The briefing paper that we're launching today highlights the risks that gas companies pose to highly productive, highly profitable farmland that is under threat, and the risk that gas developments pose to agriculture's workforce, farmers' mental health, the social cohesion of regional communities, and the fact that further expansion of the gas industry is incompatible with tackling climate change and undermines the agriculture sector commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. These findings will undoubtedly inspire many robust discussions, and to help us unpack these findings more and better understand the full implications of a gas-led recovery at this crucial time, we have two very special guests joining us. The Honourable Niall Blair, who has held significant leadership roles in the public and private sector for more than 20 years. He currently heads up the Food Sustainability Department at Sturt University and will be well known to many of you as a former State Agriculture Minister, having been a member of the New South Wales Government for almost 9 years. More a bit from Niall later. But firstly, I'd like to introduce Richard Heath, the Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute, the authoring body of this paper. Richard will discuss in greater detail the key findings and, like Niall after, will be keen to take part in a Q&A towards the end of this launch. Over to you, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks for the opportunity to present this briefing paper this morning. Just bear with me while I share the screen now. So, as Wendy has outlined, the Australian Farm Institute has been very pleased to put this briefing paper together on such a critical issue for the agricultural community. We have investigated how the gas-led recovery will impact Australian farmers and agriculture generally across the country. So first of all, what is the gas-led recovery strategy? It was a strategy announced by the federal government in September of this year as part of a broader post-COVID economic recovery strategy. The main thrust of the strategy is that by increasing gas production and creating a transparent market, a more transparent market, it will make Australian energy cheaper and more reliable and aid in the economic recovery. The particular facets of the recovery, of the gas-led recovery strategy, you can see there on the screen, involve things like different agreements with LNG exporters to avoid supply shortfall and strengthen prices, boosting the gas transport networks and more infrastructure for getting gas from the exploration areas to centres of consumption, unlocking more gas exploration areas, so making sure that exploration licences are used and that fields are developed, also setting up new gas supply targets with states and territories, investigating ways to empower gas consumers, so making sure that consumers are aware of the opportunities that are there with gas as an energy source as opposed to where they might be getting energy at the moment, and also exploring prospective gas reservation scheme options. So what does all of this mean for Australian agriculture? So in the way that we've assessed that and tried to look objectively at the implications of all those things and the strategy more broadly, we have actually called really heavily on the recent Independent Planning Commission assessment of the Narrabri gas project. Now, while some of the concerns in that project were obviously specific to Narrabri, many are very relevant to the broader context of Australian agriculture. And while the IPC assessment did recommend that that project go forward, it nonetheless put a lot of quite strict caveats and conditions in place, recognising a number of significant concerns about the development. So we were able to call on that very recent, independent, very scientific and robust process and extrapolate those concerns across all of agriculture and all the exploration licences to assess how much of an impact there could be from this broader gas-led recovery strategy. And I'll start with one of the main concerns from the IPC, which was the underestimation of greenhouse gas emissions in the environmental impact statements and a lack of transparency in reporting emissions. Now, this is obviously, one of the core elements of fossil fuel energy, full stop. It's the emission story and the emissions contribution to climate change. And one of the first things to point out about that is that this strategy, this federal strategy, is actually completely at odds with every individual state's strategies and targets around emissions reduction. Every state in Australia now has a net zero emissions target of 2050 or sooner. And most states have renewable energy targets by 2030, 2040 of at least 50% or more, depending on the state, of energy production by renewable energy. So this Commonwealth strategy, the gas-led recovery, is quite at odds with what all the states are trying to do individually. It's also significantly at odds with now increasingly what the agricultural sector is trying to do with its emissions targets and its sustainability targets. So the NFF has a net zero emissions target by 2030, and most sectors now are developing individual frameworks and individual sustainability targets for their sectors that also include emissions reductions targets well in advance of what the federal government is doing, which talks about the later half of the century rather than having a particular target for net zero, but is also at odds again with this gas-led recovery strategy. So beyond those emissions implications of the gas-led recovery target, the three really significant areas that we looked at were the economic impacts, the natural capital and social capital impacts. And it's important to point out that those three things are inextricably linked. There is a cumulative impact of those three areas, specifically in the way that they intersect and impact on agriculture, that are almost impossible to tease apart. So if I'll just go through each of those individually now, but keeping in mind that they all build to this big cumulative impact on agriculture. So natural capital, again, is one of the critical areas that there is the most concern about gas exploration in, well, I was going to say in Australia, but globally, really. And particularly in that agriculture is more reliant on access to natural capital than almost any other sector of the economy. While there is the obvious above ground implications on natural capital in terms of the direct impact and damage to well, farm infrastructure is not necessarily natural capital, but the you know, roadways and disturbance of pasture and so on. It is the water asset and the underground aquifers and that natural capital that's embodied in that water asset that is the most concern about in terms of the impact and potential impact of gas mining. And again, that was one of the main concerns put forward out of the IPC assessment of the Narrabri Gas Project, and their highlighting of the low level of confidence in groundwater impact modelling. Now, that's a real concern where you've got such a low level and you know, that very stringent process from the IPC and that so robust assessment, which basically came to the conclusion that the impact of gas development is relatively unknown. There is just not the confidence in the data to say definitively that gas exploration will have minimal impact on groundwater and aquifers. And when you consider the importance of water to Australia and Australian agriculture, and particularly the aquifers and the Great Artesian Basin, the fact that we have so little knowledge about what gas exploration will do to that aquifer is really concerning. The economic impacts. Now, there is no doubt that some landholders will benefit from gas exploration and that you know, there is economic compensation for gas exploration on farms. And some individual farming enterprises will work well with gas mining companies to exploit that. However, for others, it fails to account for the broader impacts of gas development. So the economic impact, the broader economic impact of gas development, and how the land users that don't have that immediate compensation experience that. Again, could be severe, and calling straight back on that water use or that potential impact on water aquifers that I just talked about previously, the potential economic impact of people, of water contamination, of impacts on water supply could be catastrophic for those that are impacted by potential disruption like that. Again, there are also immediate or direct economic impacts as well, potential economic impacts. And we've seen quite an exploration of that recently in terms of the insurance example, where there is a reluctance from some insurers to provide public liability insurance if there is gas infrastructure on farms. The other important thing to keep in mind in terms of because this strategy is promoted as a way of building regional economies, and jobs are obviously very important to regional economies, is that there are in fact 1.8 jobs lost in the agricultural sector for every job gained by the gas sector. So, you know, there is a net negative benefit for agriculture in terms of jobs where they're in areas where there is gas exploration. The social capital impact, again, is a really critical factor in understanding the impact of gas development and gas exploration. The Australian Farm Institute has recently done quite a bit of work in this area, looking at land use conflict. That's some research that will be released soon. And it's really evident now, and increasingly evident and increasingly stark, the impact on mental health, the impact on social cohesion, where there is land use conflict related to all types of mining, but particularly coal seam gas exploration in areas of Australia. It is leading to fragmentation of regional communities, and it is leading to quite severe mental health issues in the community. And a lot of that is driven by this complete imbalance of power, the feeling of imbalance of power of family farms and small businesses in dealing with large gas exploration companies. The report contains a case study looking at the farm of Bridget and Owen Price in central Queensland. And the case study, I won't go into it in too much detail here. You're welcome to look at the report, which is going to be available to download from the AFI website. But the case study really highlights virtually all of those issues that I've just talked about in terms of the range of impacts that are possible from gas exploration, and shows it, in an actual experienced situation. So what's the extent of this? What's the extent of this potential impact and the significance to agriculture as a whole? So we've put together some maps. I'm just showing one of them here, but there is a whole series of maps, again, that will be available to download from the AFI website, where we've looked at the extent of petroleum exploration licences, which is where gas mining will be allowed. And these are the current ones. So part of the gas exploration, part of the Gasled recovery is actually to expand those areas as well. And so that's the red shaded areas, and they sit over the top of the green is all the grazing land in Australia. The yellow is the cropping area. It's a bit hard to pick out, but the blue is irrigated cropping area. And then the blue outline is the Great Artesian Basin. And you can see that it's actually a third of all currently grazed land in Australia is covered by petroleum exploration licences. So it's a really significant area of Australian agricultural production that could potentially be impacted by these sorts of concerns and these sorts of threats that I've just talked about. 42% of the Great Artesian Basin is covered by petroleum exploration licences. And when one of the main concerns of gas exploration, as highlighted by the Independent Planning Commission, is that extreme uncertainty about the impact on groundwater, to think that 42% of our most important aquifer is covered by petroleum exploration licences, again, is a really significant concern. So just to summarise all of that, and I guess highlight our conclusions from this briefing paper, is that we believe that a much more reduced risk approach is needed than what is currently put forward in the Gasled recovery strategy. Australian agriculture is already a very, very risky enterprise. It's the second most riskiest agriculture sector in the world. And the Gasled recovery just introduces another layer of risk that we don't have to have, because there are alternatives. And I know Niall's going to expand on this and talk about this more. It's not that we don't have alternatives for energy production that are lower risk. And the reason that it is such high risk is that we don't have that data. We don't have the extent of really good, robust data on the impact of exploration on natural capital. And without that, it's actually, it's difficult to limit the activities which can cause unknown damage, because we don't have the data there. We're flying blind with a lot of this sort of stuff. Again, to evolve, to reduce risk, we should be prioritising R&D on renewable energy for ag more than we are, to advance those alternatives that are there, and improve the resources to help farmers understand their rights in this area. So that I'll leave it there. I think hopefully that's enough of a summary, Wendy, and I think Niall's going to talk a bit more now about some of the alternatives.
You're on mute, Wendy.
Can do that. There we go. How's that? The old saying of 2020, you're on mute. Thank you for that, Richard. Fascinating and confronting. I think what I'm hearing a lot is the opportunity cost and the fact that the federal position and strategy is at odds with not only state governments, but industry and the unknown is the other thing that really is confronting in this piece, isn't it? The depth and the breadth of this impact and what it means to social cohesion, mental health, sustainability of farms. It just is so broad sweeping. So thank you for that summary of this briefing paper. That was fascinating. And I know that there'll be lots of questions coming to us at the end to discuss from the people attending today. So thank you again. Moving right along now to Niall. Niall Blair is an incredible champion for rural and regional Australia, a strategic professor of food sustainability. It's a very grand title, Niall. At CSU, he's perfectly placed to critique the impact of a gas-led recovery on farming communities, and we're thrilled to have him with us. Niall will discuss the impact of gas-led recovery on aspects of the agricultural supply chain and sustainability, as well as paint a picture of a better future for rural and regional Australia. Welcome, Niall. Over to you.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks everyone for your time, and also hard act to follow following Richard, particularly with the level of knowledge there, but I think a great summary of the report. Before I kick off, I also would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're all meeting on, and because I'm from Charles Sturt University, we have a very large footprint on Wiradjuri land throughout New South Wales, and the motto at our university is Yindi Mara Winganara, which is a Wiradjuri saying for the wisdom of respectfully knowing how to live well in a world worth living in. And I think that is a great segue into this report, because what we've seen, particularly from the presentation from Richard, is that if we were to follow a gas-led economy and how it impacts on ag, we can very clearly see that although there may be great reward for a small number of farmers, the risk is borne by a larger number, and particularly when we look at some of those aquifer impacts that potentially could happen from gas exploration, we know that there is a large risk. In reading this report and seeing the gas response from the federal government, we need to think about where we are in time to have a look at how this plays in with what we're seeing in industry and also some of the alternatives that are out there at the moment. 10, even 15 years ago, when there was a lot of interest around gas, we didn't have as many of the alternatives, and the technology wasn't as sophisticated as it is now to be able to clearly put this into contrast with what is being prosecuted by pushing this gas-led agenda and its impacts on our farming communities. We know that we are at a situation now right across the country where the alternatives for renewables are viable. They've come to they're viable, reliable, and also accessible, particularly to all of our farmers. That hasn't been the case. Some of them have been expensive. There also has been obviously issues with reliability, but the more that we're seeing technology around battery storage, for example, coming into play, the more that we know that this is something that can be a really viable alternative than just moving towards the fossil fuels like gas exploration. We also know that this is where industry is heading, and it's not just the ag industry, it's all industries are heading towards the focus of more renewables. One, because a lot of their shareholders and consumers are demanding it. You know you're onto a good thing when your beer company is moving towards 100% renewables. This is something that we've seen with VB now being marketed as being brewed using 100% offset solar power to brew that beer. When you look at VB, you don't traditionally think about someone that may be interested in renewable energies and that consumer group that they may be targeting. But that's a very clear indication that this is where industry is heading. And it's no different when we look at the farming sector as well. So that we know that shareholders, we know that the boards, and we know that the consumers are all wanting a more sustainable food and fibre sector. And that's something that certainly is at risk if we move down solely putting all of our eggs into that the gas-driven recovery and economy going forward. The other thing is that we know that a lot of the sustainable renewable energy systems are better placed to coexist with food and fibre production. And I think that's one of the key things here. We know that if we look at the alternatives and some of the case studies in the report, it's usually one or the other, particularly when we're looking at that competition again around the water assets. But we see a much better coexistence with some of our renewable energy systems, particularly in agriculture. We know that Australian farming has been synonymous with renewable energy from day one. This is the iconic picture of the Australian windmill. It has been around for a very long time, and that's why I sometimes get a little bit confused when people start to question whether our farmers are people that are going to be big adopters of renewable energy. I know that for a long time we haven't been able to see whether it's a weather station or an electric fence that isn't powered by probably a small solar unit, and we're now seeing that being scaled well and truly up into farming enterprises right around the country. That's also the difference. The accessibility to renewables and the small scale to be able to generate not just energy for your own farming systems, but also to be able to put back into the grid isn't limited to you living on a particular pell or where there may be a deposit of a fossil fuel. The beauty is with these renewables is that access to wind, hydro, access to sunlight, and then also some of the other generation alternatives around whether it's biomass, biogas, biodiesel, are all available right throughout the country, rather than just limiting into certain areas of the country where we may see some of these deposits. So having an alternative that is complementary to farming systems rather than one or the other, or forcing this land use conflict, that has a lesser impact on the natural capital and the natural resources, but also is now reliable, makes absolute sense to be able to put more energy and investment into this area rather than going back 10 years and looking at those gas alternatives. The other thing is, when we talk about sustainability with farming, energy is only just one part of that, but it's also a key part of where we're heading with sustainable agriculture in Australia. And as we move away from a linear economy to a circular economy, we actually get to see some really fascinating opportunities coming off the back with renewable energies. If we were just to take the issue of food waste, for example, if the total greenhouse gas emissions from food waste globally was a country, it would be sitting around number 3 in total emissions. The amount of green waste that's going into landfill, that's decomposing and setting off greenhouse gas emissions, is a big issue globally. I've looked at this firsthand. I've travelled across to my parents' homeland in Northern Ireland, where they have 8 years of landfill left in Northern Ireland, and they are addressing issues like food waste in a much more aggressive way than what we are in a country like Australia, where we have an abundance of land and there is a level of complacency of what we're putting into landfill. But as we move away from a linear economy, we can actually start to look at other types of sustainable energy production, even by addressing other issues like food waste. And we start to look at biogas and biodigesters being part of that energy mix as well. And that can happen on farm. It can happen post farm gate through our value add and processing businesses. And it can also move right down and have an impact where the consumer themselves can also play a role in this. And we know that there are many of these different types of energy generation alternatives that are popping up. So they're not just there to address the energy issue, they're also addressing part of our waste and our greenhouse gas emission issues at the same time as well. And we know that circular economy is not just a buzzword anymore. It's also playing a big role with what the government is doing at a federal level and trying to reduce waste and recycle everything from plastics right throughout the supply chains. So this focus on a gas-led economy seems to be at odds with some of the other priorities and some of the other challenges that we're seeing throughout the country, but it's absolutely at odds with what we're actually seeing happening in the market, with what industry is doing, and what some of the opportunities are. I would argue that the opportunities around renewable energy generation, renewable energy or energy input reductions, particularly around cost, and renewable energy access to all farmers throughout the country is far greater than if we were just to focus and head down this gas-led recovery. And going back to the start of my presentation, where I said that the risk versus the reward, in the gas side, as I said, it's a high risk for a reward for a few. I would say that the reverse is the case when we look at the renewables. We know that there can be a reward for so many more, particularly farmers right throughout the country, if we started to focus more about the integration of renewable energy systems into sustainable farming practices. And we know that the risk is far less reduced. We know that the impact on natural resources and natural capital is far reduced. And we know that everyone can share in this. So I'd like to particularly point out that this report does a great job in telling us that we probably don't need to continue to focus in this area when we talk about agriculture. We know that there are other opportunities that are available, and we see those reduction in numbers of people employed in farming. We can start to offset those with some of the uplift that we can see, not just in the renewable energy sector, but if we then start to have microgrids and smaller economies that are focused closer to farm gate, bring back some of the value add businesses that we can try and be a bit more competitive in what we're doing, reduce some of the issues around transport, increase provenance. These are all starting to make a lot more sense when it comes to sustainable agriculture. So finally, like it or not, we are moving away from a linear economy when it comes to particularly our farming sector. Food and fibre production is moving away from a linear economy, going down the path of focusing on a fossil fuel energy supply is just more of the same. It's absolutely in that linear economy approach. Moving towards approaches that are more sustainable and part of a circular economy is where we are seeing the sector globally head, and also what we are seeing more and more happening here in Australia. It's less risk. It gives a better uplift for all of our farmers. The technology now is reliable enough to be able to be part of this. We will see farming tractors, trucks, utes, everything being powered in the future using batteries. We're started to see some of the companies not supplying diesel vehicles after a certain date, particularly coming out of Europe. This is happening. And this, I think, report shines a great light on that, and it's something that we can all embrace and see the uplift on the other side of as well. I'll leave it at that. I could probably stand on my stump and talk for much longer on this, but can I just again congratulate everyone that's been involved in this report. I think it's timely and provides a lot of great alternatives for everyone to think about and be able to implement right across the country. Thanks, Wendy.
Oh, thank you, Niall. That was fascinating and really well said. Here, I think. It really interesting how exciting the opportunities are coming out of this forward-thinking position that's inclusive, and it really, interestingly, even as you say, helps further some aspects of the federal government's agenda. You would think it would be a no-brainer. So thank you so much, Niall, for that, and also to Richard. I'm really excited now to throw open the floor, if you like, to some questions from our audience members. And I might get the ball rolling with a question, probably most likely for Richard. The first question I've got here, does anyone have a good measure on how much gas escapes into the atmosphere as compared to how much is burnt?
So fugitive emissions is, again, I mean, I hate to keep harping on the point, but there seems to be so many unknowns and so much lacking in having really good, robust data around this. It is understood that fugitive emissions are a really big problem. The extent of that problem is every day becoming more and more known. And there is now technology that is able to look at, at a sort of molecular level, the methane that is being produced in the atmosphere, and determine whether that is fossil methane or biological methane coming from animals and so on. And that will give us a much, much better idea of just how much is escaping from production. So at the moment, there's an understanding that's significant. The exact numbers and quantities and how significant it is and compared to biological methane, science is still developing around that.
Fabulous, thank you. Second question for you, Richard, I think. If there's such a lack of data on the effect of water, why was the IPC able to approve the Narrabri gas?
Look, that's a great question. I'm not going to comment in detail on IPC procedures. They've got a whole process that they run through. Niall's probably more familiar with that than I am in terms of how, at the end of the day, they assess and approval. I think it's just they look at the overall, net impact of everything and make an assessment based on that.
Thank you. And finally, Richard, for you, what inducements are the gas companies offering to farmers on and below whose land the gas extraction hardware is installed and process water disposed?
So, look, every agreement between a farm and a gas company is individual. They're individually negotiated, and there's I guess not a lot of transparency there, so I'm not going to, I can't sort of say there's a rule around this. There's, a understood procedure in terms of how much people might be getting. It varies from region to region and the type of activity that's going on. But what I will say is that, and it is important to note this, that, there are some areas where there is coexistence. Now, coexistence is an interesting word, and I know in our case study, the prices talk about not wanting to coexist, but to thrive. But, having said that, you have to acknowledge that in some areas, there are relationships between gas companies and farm businesses where the farm businesses feel that they are adequately compensated for the direct impact to their land.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. One for, I think, a much broader conversation, and certainly a question that at Farmers for Climate Action we confront constantly. A question perhaps for you, Niall. What is the net effect of all the states and territories heading in one direction on climate action and the Commonwealth in another?
Confusion. And that's the problem. When you get confusion, you don't get certainty, and that can lead for particularly a lack of investment from the private sector. And I think that's probably what we've seen in Australia for some time now around energy policy. I think that any organisation that sees confusion and is worried about the rules or the goalposts being moved or changed at any time sees that as a risk, and that can impact on investment. I think that what we've seen, and I'm in New South Wales, so what we've seen in the last week, we've seen new energy policy pass through the Parliament in New South Wales that will create some certainty for that. But again, the simple answer is we just need to get everyone on the same page. I think that the uncertainty is the biggest killer here, and people are confused. We've had so many different policies, so many different programs. I think that's the impact.
And do you think that the investment and the market is probably the most powerful voice at this moment to do that?
Look, there's only one way to herd cats, and that's to put the milk bowl in the middle, and so they can all see it, and that's where they move to. And usually the investment and money is the thing that drives most things in these areas. So I think the signals that we're seeing from industry, whether it's our multinational food companies and what they're interested in, and some of the projects that we're working on a farm level with their suppliers, whether it's our large energy retailers or generators that are moving into this space. I think that we are seeing the industry and the private sector probably moving at odds with what we're seeing from the government policy side of things as well. So I think that will continue. The hard part is this still continues to be an us and them argument. And I actually, this is the thing that probably I'm disappointed about the most. As I said, for some reason, there's a perception out there that farmers don't embrace renewable energy. And I just, I use that argument of the windmill, the solar panel, the small hydro systems, all of these things. It just doesn't make any sense to me. This is not a dirty word. This is just smart. It's like saying to the farmer in Western New South Wales, you've got these feral goats roaming on your property. That's what got a lot of them through the drought. They actually herded them and sold them. Why wouldn't they do the same with the wind or the sun that's on their property as well? Capturing something that's on their property to either reduce their inputs or to turn into an income generating asset, it's a no-brainer. And that's why I just really don't like the us and them argument.
Great, thanks, Niall. Two more brief questions, and then we will be able to let our wonderful guests and you good people off to your day. One from Anthony Houston, a fabulous friend of Farmers for Climate Action. What is the percentage of gas currently exported compared to domestic consumption? Niall or Richard?
I don't have numbers with in front of me, but I think that's been part of the challenges in the sector, is that we do have a lot of gas, and a lot of the domestic pricing and structures that we have here in Australia are based off that export price. We're now seeing gas import terminals being proposed to be built. We may see gas from Western Australia exported via ships and landed on the East Coast. We may see gas that comes from another country because of the spot price at the time may be cheaper to land in Australia. This is certainly, there are many levers and issues here that have created some of the challenges and particularly the price issues in this country. And that is one of the reasons why the government were trying to open up more gas into the sector to try and bring that price down. But it is that impact on that export that market and the way that it drives the price here domestically that I think has led to some of these policy settings.
Anything to add to that, Richard?
No, just to back up what Niall's talked about, and I think that, unfortunately, some of the policy settings are still based on, historical price signals, which just aren't there anymore. There was a time where gas production was pretty cheap. A lot of the new gas fields now, they're actually quite expensive. And it's not the sort of cost that there was a while ago. And particularly when you look at the rapidly reducing cost of renewable energy generation. And I just want to highlight too, the really big factor of renewable energy that I don't think is being sort of put forward well enough in the whole regional recovery story as well, is the distributed nature of renewable energy. And what that allows in terms of on-farm processing and new business opportunity, you know, the opportunity that's there through cheap renewable energy on-farm to build secondary processing and pull more value inside the farm gate through doing that. That's, you know, a new factor that can potentially significantly change regional economies and make agriculture look very different to what it does today. And that won't happen with the, as Niall talked about, that old sort of linear model, undistributed energy production. Renewable energy will do that.
Great, great. And finally, just a brief comment maybe from both of you for our final, quite, you know, optimistic and action-focused question to close. For farmers who are concerned about opening up new gas basins and projects, what can we do about it? Richard.
We can lobby, but look, I want to finish with a positive note, and to back up some of the things that Niall was saying as well. The market is moving this way, right? It's going to happen now. Policy is acting as a barrier at the moment to how quickly the market can move. The market's still going to persevere though, because that's the way that it works. Renewable energy production is cheaper. It's easier. All the long-term investment, all the global signals, all the market signals are towards renewable energy generation. Policy can accelerate that. Policy can help that and remove some of the barriers to that happening. So I'm not, I'm not pessimistic that we are going to have the whole country overrun with gas exploration, because the economics aren't there. It's just not going to make it work. And it's just ridiculous that we're not sort of pulling down these policy barriers to the alternatives happening more quickly.
Great, thank you. Niall, closing comments to that question.
Well, I think you're doing it and doing it the right way. Number one, forming a network of people that can be champions and voices to counter the stereotype that's been presented at times as to the opposition to things like renewable energies or addressing, or trying to address the issues that we're facing with the climate. So I think the Farmers for Climate Action is a great start. Two, you need to back that up with data and evidence and economic data. And that's what this report does. To me, you can only talk to a bean counter about beans. So having the numbers around the jobs, having numbers around the risk, having numbers around the opportunities, I think is the right way to do it. And I'm confident that having people speak up, having people say that they don't want to be labelled as that old school person that maybe is the base of some of our elected officials. I think is the right way to do it. But you do it in a way that is like this. It's not trying to pitch each ends of the argument against each other. It's putting the facts on the table, identifying the alternatives, backing it up with the jobs and the opportunities that are available. At the end of the day, decision makers get elected by their communities, and if we can put more people into those communities that rely on these renewable energies, if we can put more people into the communities that are backing circular economies and sustainable farming systems, then that's got to get through and be influenced in the vote, and hopefully get our decision makers on board as well. They all know who their big employers are, and this is just a part of it. I've seen the system from inside, and now I'm using my powers to try and influence from the outside as well. But this is the right way to do it. I think that this report, this organisation, forums like this, just more of it.
Great advice. Thank you. Please all join me in thanking our very special guests today, in Richard and Niall, and thank you all too for your interest in our paper and better outcomes for farming communities. Thanks to the AFI and ACF for working with us to produce this really important paper. But before you go, and there is always a last request for your help, we'd like to ask for you to add your voice to the call for a better future, a call to the government to take their foot off the gas by signing our petition. I think there's a link now in the chat box. We can go to our website. And we'd strongly encourage you to contact your local member to voice your concern. Much as Niall just said, it's all about the public and telling the politicians what they want, what they expect. And please, voice your concern about this gas-led recovery directly to our leaders. If you're interested in getting more involved, we have farm outreach coordinators working on the ground with farmers on climate solutions right now. Get in touch, and we will be more than happy to give you a call and let you know how you can join our movement. Ultimately, we need to have our voices heard. Farming communities, indeed the entire country, simply cannot afford any further investment in mining or in fossil fuels. So thank you all again so much for your time today and your fascinating insights and contribution to this discussion. We look forward to seeing where this report and other work in this space can take us.